There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is the founder and chairman of the Black Americans for a Better Future, Raynard Jackson. Wright Lewis teaches history at Howard University and is the author of A Curse Upon the Nation, Race, Freedom and Extermination in America and the Atlantic World. And Hilary Shelton is the NAACP's Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy and Director of its Washington Bureau. Thanks to all of you for being in the studio with me. Hilary, it's Black History Month 2018, and of course we are now living in the age of Donald Trump, who's made some very controversial, some may say racist statements in the year that he's been president. And there's at least one Quinnipiac University poll which says that the level of hatred and prejudice has got worse under President Trump. Do you agree?
To a point, I do. As a matter of fact, to think about the role of a president in the United States of America, we usually view them as a unifier. When circumstances, conditions, experiences occur in our country, we look to them to help bring us all back together. Even as I think about the comparison between Trump and the previous president, the first African-American president of the United States, of course, Barack Obama, when a racist incident occurred in our country, I'll point to his college professor, Skip Gates. Skip Gates is coming home from a big trip in China. He gets to his house, has trouble opening the front door. The driver of his limousine that brought him in from the airport waits for him. He goes around to the back of his house in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Very expensive homes, by the way. One of the neighbors notices someone moving around the house and decides to call the police. It looks a little suspicious. Maybe you can come out. The police officer coaxes him out of the house to tackle him. He's someone that walks on a cane. Very slight man, by the way, but quite brilliant in an awful lot of ways. But it turns into a scenario where the president recognizes that this is racial profiling. This once again happened in our country. Skip Gates is now victimized as well. Wants to demonstrate to the country, here's how we handle these situations, and holds a beer summit in the backyard of the White House. Some of us were critical of it and whatnot, but understood what he was trying to do. It was a unifying moment. It was an opportunity for him to demonstrate what we do when these racist incidents occur in a way that we can agree to disagree, but agree not to be disagreeable. We turn now to President Trump. We have a scenario in which one of the most violent historic groups in the country, among other groups, are marching in Charlottesville, North Carolina. Excuse me, Charlottesville, Virginia. Excuse me. They're marching, they're chanting, violence occurs. He decides that that is as faulty to those who were victimized by the violence that were there actually shouting and disagreeing and actually utilizing that First Amendment right, and those that took it to the point that they were there actually promoting segregation, but also violence in that process. He flip-flops. First he says all the wrong things, then he says the things that sound like he wants to unite us, but then I guess he felt better going back to the things he said the first time.
Right.
In essence, I would argue that that kind of demonstration, among other things, is a dog whistle. In essence, those who want to promote hatred, segregation, and discrimination, like those marching in Charlottesville, that included the Ku Klux Klan, that included the Nazi Party, that included the Posse Comitatus, even David Duke himself was there to participate and support the white supremacists. They were there to demonstrate and so forth. But our president decided that rather than use that as an opportunity to unify, he would use that as an opportunity to blow that dog whistle again and send all the wrong signals, we believe, to the country, both those who are racist and extremists and those that are wondering at what point will our president in one of the most diverse countries on the face of the earth actually recognize his responsibilities and duties.
Okay, let me get your view on this. Is it perhaps a little bit too easy for us to blame Donald Trump and say that he is totally responsible for this recent rise in racism, when, as we heard Professor Myers say there in that report, that it's the movement that put him in power that's the problem?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question that these ideas have been circulating, whether in secret or in plain sight. And I think in some ways you can be happy that at least it's out in the open so that you can have dialogue and maybe discuss some of these misconceptions, I would say. But on the other hand, we live in such a high-intensity environment that I believe that these dog whistles that he invokes can create situations where people feel empowered to act violent towards others who they see as different from them. And part of this is sort of what I call, or historically it would be called not only the miseducation of the Negro, but the miseducation of America, in the sense that many people don't realize the historical contributions that African Americans have made to this country, but not only African Americans, but other minorities. And so the importance of Black History Month is to sort of bring out those factoids, if you will, or those stories, so that people can engage with them more holistically, and then speak to one another and not be driven by stereotypes that would suggest that you are taking our country, for example, or to reclaim the white race as if there's something being taken from the white race because of other groups becoming more successful, or the demographics increasingly becoming more of a diverse population, reflecting a more diverse population. Right. And so some of the immigrant debates are circulating about whether, in fact, some of his policies are trying to implement or take us backward, and so this is a challenge to the Black and brown community, because what it means is that it will sort of marginalize the people that are already here into thinking that they don't matter as much as people who are of European ancestry. Right. And so again, Black History Month, which is American history, does the work of trying to further the discussions. And I would say that now with Trump's election, it's more needed than ever. We find over 200%, I think it was 268% increase in the white supremacist propaganda being put on college campuses. And what we need is to sort of have a counter narrative to that.
As you say, they feel more empowered right now. Raynard, have Trump policies, or are the Trump policies taking the country backwards? Have race relations got worse in the United States?
No, Anand, thank you for having me on. I'm always kind of intrigued when people say that Donald Trump has caused an increase in racism and the alt-right. Number one, I don't know how you measure things like that, as though these pathologies weren't in existence before Trump became president.
Well, one measure is the measure that Case cited, and that is the 260% increase in extremist groups.
But how do you make causation, though? Because of that increase, there's no way for you to quantify as a result of President Trump being elected as president. That's why that happened, because those groups were already in existence before Trump came, number one. Number two, I think a lot of this is driven by the media for ratings. And for example, isn't it amazing that you can be a far-left liberal provocateur and you can get admitted to all the college campuses to give speeches, but let someone like a Larry Elder, a Black radio show host, or Ann Coulter try to go on the UC Berkeley, they get shut down. The police won't even allow them to speak. And so if we're going to have this discussion about racial pathologies, we have to, and the media especially, have to be more objective and more inclusive in the discussion. For example, did it really take the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore 3 years ago before the country realized there were problems in Baltimore, who had a Black mayor, a Black police chief, a Black congressman, a Black district attorney, and yet the pathologies in the Black community? Hilary and I grew up outside of Ferguson, Missouri, outside of St. Louis. Ferguson has been that way, Hilary, all of our lives. There's nothing changed about Ferguson.
It went through transitions. The points, I think these points should be taken in context in a number of ways as well. First, I think we want to broaden the definition of racism. So far, we've talked about it in terms of incidents of violence like that at Charlottesville and so forth. But we know racism, I think one of the best definitions I've heard, I've learned in St. Louis, as a matter of fact, was racial prejudice plus power. We've talked about the power dynamic of violence, and that is one of the power dynamics. But certainly if we look at the data, and it was very nice that the president was, for the first time I heard, actually focus in on African Americans specifically, as he talked about employment. It's the first time I've heard him do that. To say that the unemployment rate was the lowest it's ever been in history Since the data's been collected, and we know how that stuff is gone as well. Oftentimes in the history, the data simply just wasn't collected when it came to us and whatnot. But nonetheless, he raised that issue. And then we saw that just when the next report came out, the unemployment rate got worse. But here's what he didn't talk about. What he didn't talk about in employment is he didn't talk about the issue of the fact that though the unemployment rate was the lowest in history, it was still twice as high in the African-American community or more than it was in the white communities.
But that was the same thing under Obama, under Bill Clinton,
that's
under
right.
George W.
And I would disagree with you on that, and we're friends, but I'll disagree on that. One of the things I noticed, and whether it was Obama or perhaps the media's response to Obama, but I had not heard as often the media disaggregating the data by race as we talk about employment. When I'd watch CNN or when I watch CCTV, the data would always break down further the unemployment rate among African Americans, and then it even dig into some of those really hard to get at areas, like African American males between 18 and 24. And the fact that as we were talking about then, and you may remember it, in 2008, we were looking at unemployment data for all of America that was about to hit double digits. We hit 10% for a minute.
But you know what part of the reason for that also is this whole influx of illegal immigrants is devastating the economic pathology in the black community specifically. And so you have this push to legalize 20 or 30 million folks in the country illegally. And guess what? It's going to devastate the pathology in the black community, and no one's talking about that.
Okay.